I will honestly say I don't remember ever speaking a word to Esther the whole time she was there. We were never friends. We never spoke to each other, only on the set.
For almost 50 years, the truth about what really happened behind the scenes of Good Times remained hidden. But now, Jimmie Walker has finally revealed a shocking secret about his co-star, Esther Rolle, and it's nothing fans ever expected. The dynamic between TV's most iconic mother and son wasn't all smiles behind the camera. What was the real story? Was there jealousy? Tension? Perhaps even betrayal? Walker's revelation has sparked renewed interest in the beloved show, leaving fans stunned and eager for answers. The long-standing silence is broken, and the truth may change how we see Good Times forever. Now that the silence has been broken, one question still lingers. Were the rumors we've heard for years just exaggerated gossip, or was there something real hiding behind the scenes? Let's take a closer look, facts or myths. For nearly 50 years, people have been talking. Not on talk shows or magazine covers, but in comment sections, fan forums, and those classic TV Facebook groups where old shows never really die. And one of the most popular stories that always came up was Jimmie Walker and Esther Rolle never getting along. Some said they couldn't stand each other. Others said they barely spoke unless the cameras were rolling. On Reddit, one user wrote, "Esther Rolle never made it a secret her disdain for Jimmie Walker." The comment alone kicked off hundreds of replies, each one trying to piece together what really happened. On sitcoms online, fans were still debating it decades later. One user said, "I'm shocked they took their feud and made it public because there was no way they were going to win a fight with Jimmie Walker with the audience of Good Times at that time. He was the bread and butter of that show." And on Lipstick Alley, a post shared behind-the-scenes details from Jimmie Walker's own book, revealing signs of a deep rift. One commenter noted, "Jimmie felt like he was a punching bag, especially after being publicly called out in interviews." It didn't help that fans claimed to see it on screen. Every time JJ cracked a joke or delivered his signature dynamite, some swore you could see Esther Rolle tighten up, shift in her seat, or go silent for a beat too long. These weren't dramatic blow-ups. They were tiny, real moments that got magnified over time. The longer the silence lasted, the louder the rumors grew. People started assuming things. Was it about ego? Was someone feeling disrespected? All this brings us to this moment. Jimmie Walker is now 78 years old. And after all the guessing, all the back and forth online, he's finally speaking for himself. And what he said may settle one of the longest-running questions in classic TV history. What does it all look like from his side now? Let's hear it straight from the source. At this point in his life, Jimmie Walker has nothing to prove. And he just talked about what happened from his point of view. When he was asked about Esther Rolle, he didn't dodge the question at all. He said it straight, "We were never friends, we never talked. Only on the set. I wouldn't even have her number, we never did anything together." This is the exact part that seems very intriguing. The complete distance between two people who played mother and son on national television. How do they not have each other contact? For fans who grew up watching Good Times, this kind of thing hits hard. On screen, the Evans looked like a real family. But behind the scenes, it was a whole different story. There was tension. There was distance. And sometimes, there was nothing but silence. Now this is where we start to see the cracks. Behind all the laughs, something was cracking. While audiences were falling in love with the Evans family, a quiet battle was brewing. Esther Rolle and John Amos weren't just acting, they were fighting to keep the show real. They wanted real stories about struggle, family, dignity. But while Esther and John pushed for that, something else was happening. Jimmie Walker's character, JJ, started to blow up. The crowd loved him, his jokes, and his style. The dynamite catchphrase took off like wildfire. Then the network capitalized on the show's popularity, leading to a shift in tone and focus. Suddenly, it was more about punchlines than real problems. More laughs, less truth. And for some cast members, that didn't sit right. To some, it was entertaining. To others, it felt like the soul of the show was slipping away. Jimmie never fought that shift. He was doing what he was asked to do. And he was good at it. But that also meant he was becoming the face of something his co-stars didn't agree with. And that created distance. You could feel it, even if nobody talked about it back then. And now, all these years later, Jimmie's saying they were never really friends. However, it wasn't because they had a big fight. No, they actually didn't. They were just two very different people trying to do the same job but in different ways. So now that we know how distant things really were, the next question is why? What was it that pulled them so far apart, even when the cameras stopped rolling? The real root of the conflict, the real tension on Good Times, didn't start with Jimmie Walker. It started with what his character became. You see, Esther Rolle didn't hate Jimmie. That was never the issue. In fact, she made it clear in an interview, he's 18 and he doesn't work. He can't read or write. He doesn't think. The show didn't start out to be that, little by little, with the help of the artist, I suppose, because they couldn't do that to me, they have made JJ more stupid and enlarged the role. Negative images have been slipped in on us through the character of the oldest child. From that statement, it's obvious the problem wasn't the actor. It was the role. Esther had a vision for the show. To her, Good Times was supposed to portray the authentic experiences of black families in America, specifically those in the working class who faced struggles while maintaining their dignity. The comedy had a place, sure. But once JJ turned into a full-on cartoon with loud clothes, catchphrases, and over-the-top antics, she felt the show was slipping into something dangerous. It wasn't telling the truth anymore, it was just depicting fun and comedy. John Amos felt the same way. Before Good Times, he was best known as the adult Kunta Kinte in Roots. A classically trained actor with a serious approach to storytelling, he played James Evans, the firm but loving father on the show. Like Esther, he believed Good Times should mean something. He said, the writers would prefer to put a chicken hat on JJ and have him prance around saying "DYNO might," and that way they could waste a few minutes and not have to write meaningful dialogue. It was more like, the more the writers leaned into the fun part, the more disconnected he felt. As JJ's popularity skyrocketed, the writers began building episodes around him. The show started tilting in a direction. That left less room for the parents, especially for the deeper, more serious storylines Esther believed in. This shift didn't sit right with Esther. She didn't sign up for a clown show. And you know, fans and audiences never fail. They picked up on the tension quickly, but the coverage wasn't always accurate. Over the years, several articles and magazines misquoted Esther. One headline made it seem like she couldn't stand Jimmie Walker. But again, her words were clear, she had respect for him as an actor. What bothered her was how the character of JJ had taken over the show's message. Norman Lear, the show's creator, later shared his thoughts too. He admitted he had hoped Rolle and Amos would have been more welcoming to Jimmie. Lear believed their coldness pushed Jimmie further into himself. He withdrew. Instead of resolving the tension, things stayed quiet, but not really in a peaceful way. No one threw tantrums or whatnot. But the silence between takes said enough. They worked together, but they didn't really connect. They showed up, did the job, and went home. Not enemies and not exactly friends either. Jimmie, for his part, stayed focused on the work. He wasn't blind to what was happening. He felt the distance. But he kept to the script, delivered what the producers wanted, and tried not to stir the pot. He was only a young actor doing what the producers wanted. He played the role as written and stayed out of the way. What makes the whole story more complicated is that both sides were right in their own way. Jimmie was the breakout star. He gave the show energy. His timing was sharp, and fans loved him. But Esther and John wanted to protect something bigger, the dignity of how black life was portrayed on screen. To them, this was more than just comedy. It was cultural ground they didn't want to lose. So the conflict wasn't about egos. It was about purpose. One side wanted to keep the soul of the show. The other got swept up in what the network was pushing. And when no one found a middle ground, the division hardened. This wasn't a personal feud. It was a creative disconnect that never got fixed. However, as the cameras kept rolling and the ratings stayed strong, something was quietly shifting behind the scenes. The tension wasn't obvious at first, but you could tell it was in the room. And soon, it would reach a point where no one could ignore it anymore. Escalation and exit. When everything changed, things on the set of Good Times weren't as smooth as they looked on screen. The laughs were real, but behind the scenes, the mood had started to shift. John Amos, who played James Evans, began to feel like the show was drifting from what it was supposed to be. In a 2021 interview with Essence, Amos said, "I left because I was told that my services were no longer needed because I had become a disruptive element." He explained that he often disagreed with the writers, who, in his view, didn't understand the realities of the black working class experience. "It was tooth and nail over what we felt was right. And our convictions were predicated on the experience," he said. "They were theorizing what my reactions or the characters' reactions would be predicated on a Beverly Hills point of view. This didn't sit well with the producers." And by the end of season 3, Amos was gone. They wrote James Evans out by killing him off in a car accident. Just like that, one of the show's strongest characters was gone. Esther Rolle, who played Florida Evans, wasn't happy either. She was already uncomfortable with how the show had started to focus more on JJ's antics than the family's values. She thought it was becoming more silly than meaningful. In an interview, she said, "There's too much clowning on the show, and it's becoming meaningless. I feel that the show lacks truth, honesty and sincerity, and lacks the quality it had when we first started out."